Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Carefulist, the podcast. I'm Katie Christophic, founder of The Carefulist. Today, we welcome Jennifer Levin to the show. She is the founder of Caregiver Collective and author of Generation Care. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I am so glad that you're here. I have really been looking forward to this conversation because you have a really interesting career to talk about and the way that you've kind of gotten to this place of what you're doing now. So let's start at the very beginning. Let's talk about your caregiving story.
Sure. I would say my caregiving story began the way that a lot of people's do, in that life was totally normal every day, in the like mundane nature of your life, and all of a sudden something shockingly interrupts it.
Yeah.
And for me, I was living in Los Angeles at the time, working in television. I was in my I was 29 when my dad was first diagnosed, and then I was really in my early 30s throughout this period. And at this time, I'm building my career. I'm young, is my point.
Yeah.
Had just moved into my first apartment alone and was really establishing the beginning of my adult life.
Mm,
And then my dad was experiencing worrisome falls that were increasing in number
yeah.
and a couple of cognitive signs that didn't feel normal. And I'm an only child of divorced parents. And so, when we first got his diagnosis of Parkinson's, I felt like, well, Michael J. Fox has Parkinson's and he still works and everything's okay. We know what this is. And I did not realize it is not the walk in the park that I thought it was at the time. I have quickly learned that. But, I thought, I understand this and people keep on living with it. And
Yeah.
it turns out that was a very common misdiagnosis for what he actually had, which was progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP, which is a neurodegenerative disease that is considered Parkinsonian, but presents very similarly to ALS. So it weakens your muscles, it affects swallowing, things like this.
Mhm.
So, only child of divorced parents, and I'm living across the country from my family in New York. And
Mhm.
so at the beginning, it was very manageable. He could continue living alone. He was staunchly independent and so wanted to. But
Mhm.
then over time, it was very clear that his needs had increased. And for safety and health and well-being, he needed more supervision and intervention. And so at first, he began in an assisted living facility and eventually progressed to a nursing home. And all that while I'm pretending everything is fine in LA, while we're dealing with this disease in my family that's terrifying because
Yeah.
it's considered a rare disease. Not much is known about it. There's no cure.
Mhm.
Things have changed in the years since, and now PSP has really come along as far as the amount of research that goes into it. But at the time, it was really families just figuring out how to deal with it.
Yeah.
And so, I'm dealing with this from afar. I was a long distance caregiver, and any moment that I could get away from work, I was flying to New York to go be with my dad to help him and to deal with logistics that I was figuring out for the first time in myself. I'd never even stepped inside a nursing home before when I had to choose where my dad would live. And, I really internalized that time that I was an outlier to my friends because although they were and remain very supportive, no one else I knew at that time had gone through something similar, particularly with a parent. And
Yep.
so while I'm listening to my friends, kvetch about dating drama and all this stuff, and I had just gotten off the phone with my dad telling me about the clinical trial he's going to start or whatever it is, I'm looking at what's going on in the, age appropriate world of my peers and thinking
Mhm.
like, this is such bullshit, frankly.
Yeah.
I just couldn't relate in that moment. And there was definitely a chasm created. And so I did not consider myself a caregiver though until after my father had passed.
Mhm.
The disease with him moved very quickly, and he passed away when I was 33.
Oh, I'm so
So,
sorry.
oh, thank you. It was really, I felt like I was his daughter. I was doing the things that family do. My dad
Yeah.
needs help, I step in. That's what you do. Although the weight of it was, and the stress of it was like something I had never experienced before, because it literally felt like life or death in the decision
Yeah.
making things, and at times it literally was.
Right.
Um, and to take on somebody else's well-being, let alone an adult man with very strong opinions, when I haven't raised a child yet, the experiences are not the same, but there's a level of prioritizing somebody else ahead of your own needs that this was
Yes.
my first time really experiencing that. And it wasn't until, I don't know, a year later, maybe a little less, that I read a study, and it really spelled out what a caregiver is, because I thought that they were paid professionals or people my mom's age, helping out a
Right.
geriatric
Yes.
parent. And I
Yep.
really hadn't considered that I was a caregiver. And
Yep.
so when I talk about what my caregiving story is, that is my family experience and my experience that brought me into caregiving. But I think of my caregiving story as everything that came after it, once I could contextualize what that experience was and how much it connects me to other people in my generation and, generations above and below, but also everything that kind of came from that experience.
Yeah. Oh my. Thank you for sharing that. It is so tough. One of the things that you talked about, and that's something that we haven't heard a ton of on my particular show, is being an only child
Mm,
of divorced parents. So, like, you were it. And
yes.
that is a huge amount of stress. I mean, I was your age, the same age. I was in my late 20s, early 30s when my
Mm,
mom had dementia.
wow.
And I just had my daughter was 3 and I had just had my son. And so
So you had
it was
plenty of
really
time
something.
to deal with it. Lots of time on your hands.
And
Yeah.
working full time, trying to build a career as you do at that age.
Hmm.
Um, and I completely relate to your peers living a completely different life.
Hmm.
There is a level of life or death responsibility that they, as much as they want to be supportive and they want to understand where you're coming from, they just can't. You
Hmm.
cannot imagine it until you've lived it.
Absolutely. And I think there's two types of stresses that are, I mean, more, but two main sources of stress that are born from being an only child, which
Mhm.
is one, the logistical stress of there's no one really in my position as
Yeah.
well who can relieve some of the things I'm doing. And I
Mhm.
know that I have enough experience in the caregiving world to know that just because you have siblings doesn't mean that people share responsibility.
Yeah.
And I've learned that more and more. But when you know that you're the only one in that position who's the young, strong one who can schlep this thing up the stairs or,
Hmm.
do whatever needs to be done, there's that stress. But then there's also the emotional stress of not having somebody your age who this is also their parent or grandparent or
Right.
whoever it is you're caring for. They're also in that emotional place that you are, that you can relate to and have a shorthand with about that.
Yep.
Nobody else really understands it the way that a sibling might.
Yeah. And that's where you and I differ. I have siblings,
Mm,
so we were able to talk. And so there was that little bit of support. And it would have been a much harder way to go had I not had them. So I really feel for you.
yeah, thank you. Although I have to say, the first caregiver I met who was my age, we met over the phone, we were connected
Mhm.
professionally, and she was one of seven caring for her parents. She had a toddler, she lived in a different state, and she was the only sibling to take on care.
That is really common. It seems like
It's the most
the
common, actually.
bigger the family, it
Hmm.
falls to one person. So, I mean,
Hmm.
there's 3 in my family, and it primarily fell to 2 of us with a third helping. Um, But yeah, the more people I talk to, if there are four or more siblings for whatever reason, it seems like there is just one person who's expected to be the
Mhm.
one to handle it.
Yeah, and I just, in studies that I've read, statistically, when there's siblings, no matter how many, it is likely that one will take on the majority of care.
Yeah.
So even if other people are emotionally invested or do help out, it really does primarily fall on a sole
Hmm.
provider.
Yeah. Yeah. And, just to be clear, if anybody's listening to me for the first time, my dad was my mom's primary caregiver.
Mhm.
So we had that, call it a benefit, for lack of a better term. And then we were his backups.
Mhm.
So we were much more fortunate than a lot of people.
Yeah, I understand why you want to qualify your experience in that way. I also find that so often we come up with reasons to explain that it wasn't that bad for us. Do you know, it's like I was even interviewing somebody for my book, and of course I'm deep in the caregiver world in a lot of different respects. And so I have some self-awareness about where I fall in the context of things. And I
Yeah.
said to him, but I was a long distance caregiver. And he said, listen to what you just said. Like, don't minimize what you did. You were a caregiver, the end, you know?
Yes.
Because when you are in that role, you know that even if your father was the primary caregiver, or I mean, you said your father, right, for your
Yeah.
mom?
Hmm.
Yeah. Like, even if that's the situation, or if it's another sibling, or however that looks, or particularly with long distance caregivers who think,
Yeah.
like, well, I'm not living with them, so I shouldn't be able to say that I'm a no, that's the experience. It looks a lot of different ways. You
Hmm.
are still displaying the symptoms of stress and burnout, and like you're still devoting a lot of time to it. It's just there's stress one way or the other. And
Yeah.
people kind of look at outside experiences of like, well, they have it worse. And it's like, well, let's really look at our
Yeah.
experience and what it truly means.
Right. Yeah. No matter what, it is a life upheaval.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, one of the things I like to ask people who come on the show is what, how do I want to say this? A lot of people want to be supportive of caregivers, but they don't know how.
Mhm.
So, what is something that someone did for you or said to you that was helpful while you were going through this?
I would say in my particular experience, it is when friends have checked up on me
Mm,
and just called, texted, said, I'm thinking about you. How's this person doing? Just made me feel like I wasn't forgotten. The
yeah.
things that really helped in the moment were when people showed up for my dad when I couldn't, or even just to alleviate it for me.
Yeah.
Because I was working in LA, even though my parents were divorced, they still had a relationship with each other. And my
Hmm.
mom spent a lot of time with my dad, particularly at the end, taking him to doctor's appointments, just spending time with him, really, just,
Hmm.
going for walks, meeting him for lunch, bringing him Dunkin' Donuts, just like quality time so
Yeah.
that he wasn't left alone or felt like he had been left alone. And also, I think they enjoyed each other's company. So it's
Yeah.
just a nice experience. But there was a time too that one of my friends said, I can go visit your dad and I'll bring my dog. And, like my dad was such a dog guy and,
Yeah.
didn't have one anymore. So that was just nice to know that someone is showing up to spend quality time with him.
Yeah.
And, just to know in the ways that he was cared for and I was cared for in that way,
Hmm.
um, really made a difference.
Yeah. Oh, that is such a great point, especially if someone is an animal person,
Mhm.
whether it's cats or dogs or whatever. A lot of conditions don't allow for someone to keep a pet, but they benefit so much from having, an animal to snuggle or play with or whatever.
Yeah.
That's really great, and I don't think anybody has mentioned that yet. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, I wrote a book in case you hadn't
You
heard.
did. You are an expert. I love that. Um,
I do want
there
to
are.
mention, sorry, do you mind if I mention something else as well?
Sure.
Is that I always appreciated when someone would say like, "How's your dad?" and inquire about him.
Hmm.
But in interviewing people for my book and researching through case studies, I have also found, particularly with live-in caregivers, when they're living with their, in these cases, usually parent, they begin to resent when somebody out of a they know loving heart asks how the parent is before they ask how they are.
Yep.
And so often they feel left behind in the shadow of the care situation
Hmm.
because that's a critical one, but they really feel like they kind of don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So I would like to mention that although this wasn't my experience, for so many people I've spoken to, what really makes a difference is when people acknowledge that person, even outside of caregiving. Like,
Yeah.
hey, have you heard this new song from this artist you like? Or, just kind of check in with them as a human with a full identity.
Yeah, that's great because one of the things we talk about a lot on this show is how caregiving can really change a relationship from being a relationship to just being transactional.
Yeah.
It is task after task after task. And the person who is providing the care really loses that sense of themselves because
Mhm.
they are just there to care for the other person. So I can see where people would find that off-putting. Like, okay, I'm still a person, I'm still here. It would be really nice if you talked to me about me for a minute, even if they
Yeah.
would feel a little guilty about feeling that, because people feel that too. Like,
Yeah.
oh,
Oh,
I shouldn't
yeah.
want you to talk about me because I'm not the one with the problem. Right.
Yeah. And I should mention that the people who said this to me in interviews were both dealing with situations that they were years deep in. They were
Yeah.
both women who are women in this case, who are in their mid to late 30s and had been living with the person they care for, if not for their entire lives, then for 10 years. And
Yeah.
so, there's a difference, I think, when it comes to if you're in the ICU with someone, if it's a very acute type of um, illness or experience, and in this chronic long-term care situation. And I think it's those, particularly these chronic long-term situations, when people feel overshadowed.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes complete sense. Um, so caregiving obviously is very complex. And there are a lot of emotions, there are a lot of things going on. And we just talked about, it's very task oriented. It can be hard to find moments of joy or humor or just some form of levity. Do you
Mhm.
have a memory that you'd like to share where something funny happened and you and your dad really had to chuckle about it, or a great song that you love came on and you both just enjoyed it together?
Yeah, I would say that in my family, humor is the default in a lot of situations.
Yeah.
And so we were always still joking around, always. I was conscientious to create experiences and conversations that
Hmm.
prevented my father from becoming my patient. And you do have to have the conversations that are logistic, but I always wanted to talk to him as my dad and as a person who was really freaking funny. And
Yeah.
so, it was always humor, always, which after I thought, did we use that as a source of avoidance from what was going on? And then I thought, like, I really looked at that and then
Yeah.
realized, no, it was levity. And levity is necessary to survive. If it's
Mm.
always doom and gloom, that serves nothing. You know how serious it is. You can still crack jokes. And
Yeah.
a lot of caregiving stuff is weirdly funny.
It is.
It's these weird situations you find yourself in that
Yeah.
are bizarre. Actually, what comes to my mind, I won't share because it's like It's embarrassing for my dad, even though he found it funny. I don't want to do it.
Yeah,
Like
no, I
off
understand.
camera, I would. But I would say that I can think of a very acute moment my dad thought was hilarious, which was me pushing his wheelchair. It was like, I mean, it was like Sisyphusian. I mean, it was ridiculous. You don't realize how heavy those things are until you're navigating one,
Uh-huh.
particularly on Manhattan sidewalks that are broken or some jerk is blocking the handicap accessibility part of the
Yep.
curb. Like really, it's so hard.
Yeah.
And we were always, when he was in the nursing home, always leaving and going to the park, going to lunch
Mhm.
or, different things. And I really I was constantly like knocking the wheelchair on like the side of a door frame. And he's like, oh, like it was like Monty Python practically. It was
What?
ridiculous. The physical humor that to me was endlessly frustrating because I
Yep.
was really trying to do something. And then my
Do the
shins
right
are
thing.
bruised. It's like the whole thing. And he thought it was so funny because it was like, oh,
Yep.
well, there's my daughter, the putz. Yep, here we
Yeah.
go, and like, um, that like that he found funny. I wasn't, I wasn't so
Yeah.
into. But I would say also that one great thing I really loved in the nursing home was they regularly, like, I think even weekly, had these concerts where they would bring people in
Oh,
to
nice.
sing, perform music,
Yeah.
or all these things. And we just have such good memories, my mom and I both, of like being with my dad at those events. And he always wanted to leave. Like, my father was the most impatient. So he'd always say, like, let's get out of here. Like, all the time when he was healthy, when he was ill, always, let's get out of here. And my mom was like, no, we are sitting here and we are enjoying this, the end.
Hmm.
And it really was nice to like listen to these oldies songs and everybody's like
Yep.
clapping along and it was really wholesome. And I think if I were home and didn't have that to do, I'd probably be like, what, scrolling my phone, like nothing, nothing like
Yeah.
enriching. That
Right.
these communal experiences that are built really remind you of what it's like to be in a community just for the sake of enjoyment.
Yeah. And to see the light switch on in the
Yeah.
faces of everybody, especially when it's a favorite song or whatever
Mhm.
it is. And, they get into it and they're starting to clap. It's like, oh, there is their humanity.
Oh,
And
yeah.
people need to not forget that it's there.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. My sister and I share a dark sense of humor. So we would find different things that are wildly inappropriate that I won't share publicly, but that we would laugh.
Yeah.
And so when I was trying to come up with a name for this show, I was like, what do I mean, the company's called The Carefulist. Okay, what am I going to do with it? I'm a huge Mel Brooks fan. And so I was like, Spaceballs, Spaceballs, the lunchbox. But so it's Carefulist, the podcast.
Perfect.
We need to bring the humor along because it's
Yeah.
such heavy, serious business
Mhm.
that humor is a survival skill in
Yeah.
this particular space.
Actually, one guy I interviewed in my book is a stand-up comic, and he was telling me about research that he was given, I think by AARP, about the
Mhm,
role of laughter in stress reduction, which we know, but
mhm.
particularly in a caregiving context, that it's actually physiologically a tool. And that is important to know, but also it's your life and it's their life. And
Yeah,
just because, you don't have it in the same way you used to doesn't mean it's impossible to enjoy. Yeah,
right.
and, it's that I think is important to remember that I
Yeah.
think in caregiving, we so often talk about survival tools. And I know I mentioned it, you just mentioned it when we talk about humor,
Hmm.
but I think that should be like the lowest common denominator we aim for.
Yeah,
Survival shouldn't be the apex of what we're striving for, and it
right.
often feels like it is. And I just like to remind people to try to, you know, aim for well-being and happiness. even in a really dark situation, that, you know, you can still have moments, even if it's
Yeah,
reduced to moments.
right. And it's a conscious choice.
Hmm. Yeah.
My dad, so my mom had Alzheimer's for a long time, and she was young-ish. She was in her early 60s when we started noticing symptoms. She was otherwise healthy. So the way I describe it is we hit every branch of that ugly tree on the way down.
Mm.
And so one of the last things people with dementia are able to do is smile.
Hmm.
And so my dad's goal every day, for a long time, it was to get her to laugh. But when she couldn't laugh anymore, he's like, if I can get her to smile, I did a good job today.
Yeah. Wow. Ugh.
Yeah.
I mean, but that tells you about who we are as humans, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you were working in LA.
Mhm.
We're going to jump a little bit and talk about your career and what you were doing and, how that all then ties in to what you're doing now.
Sure. I was working in television production in writers' rooms. So I was working on a lot of crime dramas at the time, which are it's fun on one hand, but when you're talking about murder every day, and then you're also dealing with this at home, it's
Yeah.
too much, I think. But I, was working TV hours, which are long, which are very long. And I was also, building myself up. I wasn't established yet. I was working consistently and working very good jobs on high profile shows, but, I was far from where I wanted to be professionally.
Yeah.
And so really, of the generation where it's like, oh, I'll give everything. Like it's no problem. I'll be here until all hours. And, I
Yep.
think like thankfully younger generations are learning or have learned not to do that. But so then it was after my father passed away, I felt like I really needed time off. I
Yeah.
was pushing too hard and I was grieving too much. And I then was encouraged, after some time had passed, I was
Mhm.
encouraged by a college friend of mine who was an editor at a magazine. She said, you have all these stories which weren't caregiving related. She said, you have all these stories and magazines would pay you for them. Like you should write some of this stuff as articles. And I'd
Mhm.
never once considered writing outside of television.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, let me give it a shot. And it wasn't the first article, but really one of the first articles I wrote was the piece for Cosmopolitan talking about my experience as a millennial caregiver.
Yeah.
And at that time, people were not talking about caregiving in the, you know, discussion of society. Like
Right.
now, it's unbelievable how much things have changed. But at that time, nobody was talking about it, and particularly nobody was talking about it amongst people our age. There was
No,
just nothing.
absolutely not.
There
Yeah.
was no support groups. I mean, there was really nothing.
Yep.
And I read this statistic which was the first one of its kind at that time that said there were over 10 million millennials who were already caregivers. And that was the article when I realized, oh, I was a caregiver. And hang on, I'm a millennial, so this is me. And I thought, I'm nerdy and I like reading scholarly research and articles, but, people should know about this because
Yeah.
that's one in four of us at that time. And technically, I know more than four people.
Right.
So I know other caregivers, and we should
Yep.
be talking about this and not so silent. And
Yeah.
so I started my group Caregiver Collective at that point to give people a place to find each other online
Mhm.
and share. It's really a support network, but the reason I started it was because I had all this information I had achieved knowledge of in caring for my dad. And now I felt like I had become a PhD in a topic that I no longer applied to me. I
Yeah.
had all this information to give that I thought I want to build some place where we can find each other and not all reinvent the wheel. Like we all can share
Right.
tips.
Yeah.
And so it was at that time then I also pitched this article to Cosmo because I wanted to meet, particularly at that moment, young women in a place they weren't expecting an article about caregiving.
Yep.
And I really wrote about my experience as a way to say, if you relate to this story, you are also a caregiver.
Yeah.
because that's the only way I would have figured it out. And so then, that took off in its own direction. I spent years just writing articles, and really the book was born, I would say, out of that article. But I mean, there was I would say in like a 7 year period until I signed a contract for the book.
Yeah.
So I was working on that book in one version or another for years and years, doing the research and figuring out the best way to communicate the information. And then it was 3 years of actually writing the book, so 3 full-time years of writing the book. And so, my career has really helped be the vehicle for
Mhm.
my involvement in the caregiving world. I also write outside of caregiving. I mean, I write fiction. Right now, I'm writing fiction and some television, but I really feel fortunate in that I know that for a lot of caregivers, journaling and writing about the experience is very cathartic. And when
Yeah.
I was working on the book, one of my good friend said to me, like, this must be so cathartic for you. And I said, no, this is awful. Are you kidding? Like, I'm sitting here remembering and reliving in my mind some of the worst things that have happened to me. But
Hmm.
I always felt like I'm not writing this for myself. I'm writing it because I want people to get this information and for it to bring us together because
Yeah.
we should not be going at this alone. And, once I'm deep in it, and it was through Caregiver Collective that I started realizing we're all dealing with instances like issues here that are like umbrellas over us that older generations are not dealing with,
Mhm.
like building a family. I mean, you mentioned that you had two small children when you
Yeah.
became a caregiver. There are a lot of people who have posted in my group, I don't know how to date when I'm a caregiver. How do I do this? Do I tell people I'm a caregiver when I'm going on a date or in a dating profile? Or
Yeah.
when you're younger in your career, you're younger in your savings history, and now, you're showing up late to work because of an emergency. All of these things were really
Hmm.
particular, one to millennials, and two to people that were young adults, and in that stage of their life. And so when I started recognizing all of these themes that everyone felt like was so specific to their situation, but realizing that they're universal issues because
Yeah.
we don't have enough conversation, we don't have an infrastructure of support, then I thought that's really why I was writing the book, was to say, like, this is affecting our generation.
Hmm.
And as definitely as a forebearer of generations after us, because this caregiving crisis is not getting better in the
Right.
US. And
Yep.
so we really need to look at what that looks like as a big picture and ask ourselves, do we want to continue living like this?
Right. Yes. Yes to everything.
Hey, that was a mouthful. Sorry. I had a lot to
No,
say.
no, it was fabulous. And I'm like, where do I want to start? Because I agree with it all. Um, the career piece is massive because, I've talked with so many people about this, especially if you have kids.
Mhm.
Like, that's one strike against you. You're a parent in corporate America.
Right.
It's already hard. Like, you're going to miss days because your kids get sick. And if you don't have somebody who lives close because people are moving for those careers. They're not staying in their hometown. So they may be states away from grandparents if they're healthy who could help. And then you add this caregiving piece. So now it's strike two. You're
Yep.
not being assigned the good projects. You're not getting promotions. You may
Mhm.
be losing your job, period, the end.
Yep.
And so, not only from a personal fulfillment and what you have worked for and thought you were going to have for your life, you are now basically placed at a financial disadvantage that you will not recover from in your lifetime.
Right.
Because rather than older generations passing inheritance or money down to
Mhm.
our generation is paying for their care.
Yep.
So that economic disadvantage is it's like trickle up.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, the inequality that it perpetuates amongst caregivers and non-caregivers and amongst within the caregiving community, racial lines.
Yes.
It's, the things that I have, the studies that I have read about how it has forced some progress backwards,
Yes.
particularly along racial inequality and income,
Mhm.
is mind-blowing. And exactly what you said, that you can, no matter who you are, find that you're not being promoted, and some of it is subconsciously in the mindset of your superiors or whoever it is at work if they know that you're a caregiver. And some of it is outright discrimination that is institutionalized, in my opinion, in certain states because there are no legal repercussions to it. They are
Yep.
legally allowed to discriminate against you. It
Hmm.
is ridiculous. Um, that it really, when I look at caregivers who have been forced to drop out of graduate programs that they've already put so much money towards,
Right.
but it's not recognized. Caregiving is not a recognized excuse by the university. And so they are forced to drop out and lose all of the credits that they worked hard for and paid for and never
Yeah.
get the degree. Or, as you were saying, people who are building their career haven't achieved seniority yet, particularly, or even people that have, but work in corporate environments or businesses in which there's no what I call corporate culture of care, where,
Hmm.
maybe the policies do exist and the benefits do exist to support caregivers, but you don't really know that they exist because they were in onboarding paperwork that you never looked at again and you didn't need
Hmm.
at the time, or that you are aware of, but you've never seen one of your bosses utilize it. And so it's
Yep.
this culture in which it's like, yeah, it's there, but
We don't
and
actually want you to use it. We want you here
yeah,
12 hours a day.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And to your point about parents, I actually hope that caregivers in the workplace take the cue from parents because parenthood, even though, faces all of the issues that you've mentioned, as far as, having to leave the office if a kid is sick, all of these things, and not being supported in that way. Um, but parenthood has been accepted earlier than caregiving has. We
Yes.
have like maternity leave has been a conversation for years
Mhm.
prior to caregiving, like family medical leave being brought into the conversation. And parents, from what I've seen, because there isn't the negative stigma around it and in the way
Mhm.
that there is around talking about someone who's ill or ailing,
Yep.
parents seem, I'm generalizing here, but to find each other within a company
Yes.
and to support
Absolutely
each
they do.
other.
Yeah.
And caregivers do not have that.
Right.
People would rather stay silent a lot of the time because they're afraid of the repercussions that we've
Hmm.
mentioned. And there is such power in banding together as a group, whether it's informally to support each
Hmm.
other and figure out like how you guys are coping and what you can be doing, but also formally to approach your employer if they don't offer something like paid family leave for medical leave. There are organizations that can help you out if there's, particularly enough of you to say, like,
Yeah.
here's why it's in your best interest as a company to provide us access to remote work or,
Mhm.
some sort of leave policy when caregiving comes up because businesses don't want to lose institutionalized knowledge. They have to
Right.
fill that spot. And if you've been working
Yeah.
there for a little while, they want to retain you and they want to retain, upcoming people who are already caregiving. They
Right.
want to be like attractive, a candidate as like an employer. And
Yeah.
so I think that in that way, caregivers can take the cue from parents, in my opinion, and talk to
Yeah.
each other and, figure out how can we make this better.
Right. And the interesting thing is, you know, parenting is a choice. People
Mhm.
can decide whether they want to be parents or not. Um, Caregiving is universal. Like
Yeah.
you're either going to be a caregiver or you're going to need care. It is going to touch you, whether you
Hmm.
want it to or not.
Yeah.
And so, from that perspective, it's wild to me that companies don't have a plan.
Yeah. I mean, but we see the repercussions economically of how many people, particularly women, that have been forced out of the workforce. We saw it during COVID. COVID
Yep.
was the first time this was really talked about, like on a national stage, because it was
Mhm.
just so, you couldn't ignore how many women were leaving the
Right.
workforce. And,
Yep.
that was existing with caregiving before COVID, and it exists still today,
Yep.
that economically it's in the country's best interest, an industry's best interest, and our best interest, everybody's best interest to
Yeah.
address this and, figure out how not to make it this like outlier of a situation that maybe some people will need whatever, but to figure out how
Hmm.
to integrate people's lives that maybe they can't control, like a hospital visit or something like that,
Yeah.
into their work life so that
Right.
it's not a choice of one or the other.
Yeah. And it costs companies so much money to train someone new.
Yeah.
It would cost them so much more to do that than to just provide a couple of basic things. I mean, people don't need the world. They just need some flexibility. Could we start there?
Yep. Yep.
And that
Absolutely.
would make a huge difference.
It was amazing to me how before COVID, there were a lot of caregivers in my group that had asked their employer about remote work for times
Mhm.
that, somebody was in the hospital and they had to be there, but they didn't want to like let their workday get out of hand by missing everything. They were saying, I can do some stuff, I just can't be in the office. And employers were saying, no, we don't have the capability for that. It would ruin the office culture, all this stuff. And then COVID happened. Suddenly overnight, they
Yeah.
need to keep
Well,
you as
look
a
at that.
worker. You can work from home now. We had it all along, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and in that way, COVID was such a stress and really, I mean, in catastrophic ways for obviously many, many people, but particularly for caregivers and like what shook out there.
Yeah.
But one silver lining was that remote work became a norm in a lot of instances and something that like infrastructure wise we knew now was in place.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, COVID. Boy, that was an interesting experience. I was just thinking as you were talking earlier about navigating your dad through the streets of Manhattan with the wheelchair.
Mhm.
Um, I'm in the Northeast, so they had restricted movement among states. So my parents were in Pennsylvania. I'm in Delaware. And for a period of time, I could not cross state lines. I could not go visit. I could not help, whatever. And then time passed and people were starting to get vaccinated and the restrictions lifted. And I was able to go take my parents to get their vaccines and my mom couldn't walk. So we had to, maneuver her out to the car. My parents had a very long sidewalk and then getting
Wow.
her into the car and getting to the hospital where they did not have great parking and navigating that wheelchair through the parking garage and across the street,
Oh,
like
God.
at a
And a
hospital.
garage, the floors are like this too. It's
I was like,
unfair.
I wish this thing had a seatbelt, Mom. I hope that you don't lean forward.
Yep. Yep.
But yeah, hitting the feet on the door jams and I just kept saying, I'm sorry. And by the time she had her shot, I was so sweated.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I remember like if there was ever a slip in the sidewalk, like pulling my whole body weight, throwing back so that you didn't go
Yeah.
flying,
Yep.
because yeah, there's no brakes on this thing. Exactly. Oh my God. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's people don't realize that you just illustrated so nicely how difficult it is to do things that we really take for granted when we have like, you know, all of our muscles working and we're not reliant on mobility devices. When I see people out now with when it's like a son with a mom in a wheelchair or something like that, I just think like I know what it took you to get out, both of you,
Right.
getting dressed, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's so worth it because it keeps you participating in the world, but at the same
Yeah.
time like people, when they look at you, don't recognize how hard it was for you to get here.
Right. Yeah. Hold the door, please. Get your stuff out of the
Yep.
aisle in a restaurant. Like, can you please leave space? Because not
Yeah.
everybody is walking.
Yep.
Or if they are, they're using a walking aid and they need more space. So,
Mhm.
ugh, be mindful of that.
Yes. That's the thing.
Pet
It
peeve.
doesn't this experience, it makes you so much more conscientious as like a citizen that now, I'm not navigating a wheelchair, but and it remained hypervigilance actually for quite a long time when I was noticing on behalf of other people. I don't
Yep.
have the stress response to it anymore, but I am still always very conscientious of someone who may need help. And I can just,
Right.
it's so easy, right? It's just you
Yeah.
hold the door, you do that, it's easy. And for them, it's not, for them, it
Yeah.
really provides so much. Um, yeah, it's really changed how I operate just in day to
Yeah.
day.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because I see it in my kids and my nieces and my nephew because they grew up around it.
Wow.
When we are out in public, I see them noticing and being
So nice.
helpers. And I'm like, okay, I mean, that whole situation was really crappy, but there are some good things that came out of it.
Yeah, and then they model it for their friends.
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, that's really nice.
I was just thinking about them. They make me happy.
Yeah.
Um, so talk a little bit more about Caregiver Collective and where people can find it and all the good stuff.
Sure. So, Caregiver Collective, as I mentioned, is a Facebook group that I founded about 9 years ago now, 10 years ago. It began as a group for millennial caregivers and
Mhm.
then very quickly expanded into Gen X, that in many ways feels overlooked and in caregiving as well. And also, not long after into Gen Z, who were already starting to take on caregiving.
Yeah.
And now it has grown over the years, of course, but in the last few years, I really say it's for anyone who feels younger than expected when they took on care.
Yeah.
I would say that it's predominantly people who are in their late 20s through late 40s, still within
Mhm.
that millennial
Yep.
spectrum. But it's a place where you can, if you have a tip that you really want to share, you could just post, or really people turn to it for emotional support. A lot of people um, think or don't know anybody who is also dealing with caregiving in their life.
Mhm.
And a lot of people have never said it out loud that they're a caregiver. And so
Yeah.
they join the group, and you could see that it's this weight off in the admission of like, okay, I'm saying out loud the thing that I'm dealing with something really hard. And
Right.
maybe in the rest of their life, they're trying to push it down a bit. Um, and, people will message, I'm in a hospital hallway right now waiting and I'm freaking out. And does anybody else have experience, with end of life or, like whatever that is?
Yeah.
Um, but it's a really solid support group. Like I don't allow memes, I don't allow cute little things, but it's when it started, I was so conscientious that everybody was acknowledged who posted. I chose Facebook. If I didn't mention it's on Facebook, I chose that because, particularly at that time as well, I really wanted a place for it to live online where anyone could find it. And, you know, caregiving, you can't control your schedule. Like in-person support groups are fantastic, but if you can't make Tuesday at 6, well, then there goes that. And so,
Right.
this was open to anyone in any state and really all over the world. We have people from all over the world in the group. Any state, any time of day or night, someone else is awake that will respond to you. And
Yeah.
so at the beginning, I knew how hard it was to talk about these things, even in a post, even digitally. And so I was very conscientious the moment I approve every post. I want to make sure there's nothing that shouldn't be in there getting in because people want to advertise to us, they want to do all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So the moment something's posted, I would try to respond like very quickly, just so they know you're not yelling into a void, that someone has
Mhm.
heard you. And the way this group was built, it was just so fantastic that I think is really a common thread amongst this generation, frankly, is people jumped into support. I would go in to, read the post and acknowledge it and everything. And then I'd found somebody else already, welcome to the group. We're so glad you're here. It sounds like this is so difficult. It was the other members really took up the mantle,
Yeah.
of creating the community. It's unbelievable. And now, it's been there for years. It's still incredibly active. We have over 2,000 people in the group. Um, and people ask about employer related questions, anything that you have a question about regarding caregiving, anything you want to share. People share just beautiful moments that happened in their day. You
Yeah.
know, um, it's just a place to be the sounding board amongst other people who get it.
Yeah. And what I love about it is it's, I almost wish Fred Rogers and Jim Henson were still alive to see the way our generation has come into its own
Yeah, I think
because
we were
of
shaped by them. Yeah.
yeah, because of creating community. We were taught from birth the
Hmm.
importance of your neighborhood and the people who live in your community and supporting them and coming together. And our generation has been through a lot. Each generation has dealt its challenges. Ours has had, I'm willing to say, more than our fair share.
Yeah. Yep.
So lending a hand to one another comes very naturally. And I am so happy every time I see a community like yours because it reminds me we are doing what we were taught.
Yep. Yep. And thank you for that. But also to your point about our generation dealing with our fair share, more than our fair share, is, I had seen early on in my writing, I had seen that millennials are caregiving at a younger age in larger numbers than ever before.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to know why. What has shaped this? Because then we know where to address it, right? And what I found was that our generation, the eldest of us, came of age and right before entering the workforce during 9/11,
Mhm.
we have had COVID, of which a lot of the spousal caregivers in my group are dealing with a spouse who's been affected by long COVID.
Mhm.
We have economic crises after economic crises after economic crises. And,
Isn't that
you
fun?
know, yeah. And in the research that I've read, it's really stark in that it shows if you're entering the workforce in one of these economic, crisis periods, or immediately after, you have
Mhm.
a shorter lifespan.
Yeah.
And we've had three in our generation of people in our generation entering the workforce with a different economic crisis. It's so we're already dealing with a stress level that is not the same. We're already
Right.
activated and sense of safety permeated, like a lot of different things.
Mhm.
But I also want to share that to your point, when you think about 9/11, when you think about COVID, when these big like generation shaping events that were totally outside of our control. You
Mhm.
also think about the community that rose from it, right? Like the people, I mean, I'm from New York, so the people that were helping each other during 9/11, all of that, COVID, we saw that as well in the US. Um, yeah, I hadn't thought about our generation as the community building one, but you're right. There's a solid argument for it.
So, talk about, I know you've spoken a little bit about your book, Generation Care. Talk a little bit more about that and then where people can find it if they want to get a copy.
Sure. So, Generation Care is a combination of my story, the stories of other caregivers, research, and interviews with experts in different fields. Whether it's I interview one expert in sex and relationships, a therapist who
Mhm.
really gives incredibly sound practical advice on different stages of a relationship you could be at that age, of, whether it's dating, whether it's getting married or family building. And, you know, across all different spectrums of the care experience as we see it in our generation. But it also tackles, what are the big institutional infrastructures that we operate in?
Mhm.
And how is it, how is being a caregiver negatively impact, going in both directions, frankly, by these infrastructures and what can be done to change that? And
Mhm.
so I really narrow it down to the the three big ones I identified were the workforce, as we talked about, the healthcare system, and then general national system of governance, like
Yeah.
because in our country, when you think about long-term care and a long-term care program, what do you think? We don't have one. We have
Right.
Medicare, which people a lot of times erroneously think includes long-term care, and it
Yeah,
does not.
it
And
does not.
you don't usually realize that until you're in the situation needing it and then
Yep.
realize you're not covered. Or Medicaid. And Medicaid helps so many people, but at the same time, there's serious problems in that you have to either be what's considered like a low income American
Mhm.
or exorbitantly rich to afford long-term care in our country. Like
Right.
there's something, and then the advice is to like pay down your assets so you're Medicaid eligible. I mean, it's so sick.
Yeah.
So those were the three systems that I identified. And then I really dug into, from different caregivers that I interview, various case studies from these interviews, what does our experience look like within these systems and how
Mhm.
can that be addressed? And a lot of times I found there are programs out there, there are small, proven supports that can be provided. And can we just look at that and expand it out?
Yeah.
Can we go state by state? What can we do? And what are the repercussions we're experiencing from not doing that? You
Yeah.
know, so it operates the book, I would say, on a few levels. One, as practical advice for somebody who's in the role of caregiver, kind of no
Mhm.
matter what age you are, but particularly for someone
Yeah.
in this period. What does it look like nationally for us, and how can we improve that? Because even as individuals, you and I, we're voters.
Mhm.
We're seeing the repercussions now of when legislature hits your particular healthcare plan. We're
Yep.
seeing that happen. And then also, I interviewed in the book one of my oldest friends. And when I interviewed her, we were sitting on her couch. I just let my recorder run and her
Mhm.
kids, playing around on the carpet. And she and I were just talking, where I even just forgot that, my phone was recording.
Yeah.
And afterwards, I thought, I really want reading the book to feel like this.
Yeah.
So many people think or believe that they don't know somebody else going through it or they don't have a
Mhm.
close friend. But you're reading my story. You have me now. Like I want you to read this book and feel like you now have friends that you can go through this with, who, in the way that I always viewed it, was like I didn't have the big sister to show me how to do it. So it's
Yeah.
like, you know, as the only child, as we were talking about, let me be the person who can kind of like help
Yeah.
you through this, but also show how we all relate to each other. That even though it is such a
Right.
specific circumstance within your family and it feels so personal, it actually connects us to each other in a much, much larger way and show something really positive about our generation, that like the community you're talking about, that we do step in for each other, that we do devote so much of our lives at our own expense, whether that's physical or economic or whatever it is. That's a really solid character trait, I would say. And we really
Yes.
can connect to each other through that and understand, so much is so negative right now, but we can
Mhm.
really look at ourselves and what the reality is, that people are doing this already. It's not a nice idea, it's happening, to take
Mhm.
care of each other and what that says about us.
Right. This is going to sound like it came out of left field, but I promise it's going somewhere. So, as you were talking, I started thinking about some research that I recently read about trees
Mhm.
and their root networks and how far they expand. And it's something that we
Yeah.
did not realize that they actually can support trees that are not doing well. They're like in an area that maybe isn't getting enough sunlight or isn't getting enough water, and they can actually share and ration their support systems.
Wow, that's
And
incredible.
they communicate with one another. So as you were saying that, I was just thinking, taking a page out of Bob Ross, maybe we could all be happy little trees.
Yeah. Absolutely. But also that also just had me thinking, just the visual of it, I came up in my mind was like of a forest and
Hmm.
all of the trees there. You know,
Yeah.
it maybe one tree starts it, but it's a collective effort, right? So that it doesn't kill the tree that's doing it.
Right. Right. It's a delicate balance, and it's
Mhm.
a give and take. And I think it's the perfect metaphor for community.
Absolutely. Wow, that's really nice. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. For folks who want to find her book, Generation Care, you can find it certainly on our website. And Jennifer, where else can they look to find that?
Sure. You can go to your local Barnes and Noble, and if it's not in stock on the shelf, then they can order it from you for you, or your local bookstore. I always love to say, whatever your local bookstore is,
Yeah,
go there. They either have it in stock or they can order it from you or from their website. It's available on Amazon and it's available on bookshop.org or through the publisher, which is Hachette.
perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story. Thank you to all of you for joining us in the car, at home, or wherever you are. And until next time, take care.